The missile leaves the launcher before the sun fully clears the Omani coast. A Fateh-110, solid-fueled, ballistic, 2,000 pounds of warhead riding a column of white smoke, rises from a concealed battery on the Iranian shore at the edge of the Strait of Hormuz, then a second, then a third. The launch site is less than 12 kilometers from the shipping lane. The target is a column of merchant vessels making the morning transit, tankers, bulk carriers, container ships, the same corridor that moves roughly a fifth of the world's traded oil on any given day. At the moment those missiles lift off, thousands of additional American troops are still in transit, aircraft carriers repositioning, logistics trains catching up. The Urgesi battery commander has done his arithmetic, and his arithmetic says, the Americans are stretched between two postures right now, the one they had and the one they're building. Strike in that gap. Strike before the surge locks in. Strike while the machine is still warming up. He is about to learn what the machine looks like when it's already awake. 9 minutes. That is all the time that passes between the moment those Fateh-110s leave the rail and the moment the battery stops existing as a military asset. Not 9 hours, not 90 minutes, 9 minutes. If you want to understand what the American surge into the Middle East actually changed, not in press releases, not in briefing slides, but on the ground, on the water, in the air, that 9-minute window is the entire answer. Stay with us. Because the battery crew made one calculation perfectly and one catastrophically wrong, and by the time we're through, you'll know exactly which was which. Geography here is everything. The Strait of Hormuz is approximately 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest navigable point. 2 inbound lanes, 2 outbound lanes, a separation zone in the middle, each lane roughly 3 kilometers across. Every supertanker, every LNG carrier, every container ship moving between the Persian Gulf and the open Indian Ocean passes through that corridor. On a normal day, between 15 and 20 tankers make the transit each way. The numbers aren't abstract. They translate directly to fuel prices in Tokyo, Rotterdam, Mumbai, Los Angeles. Close the strait for 48 hours and you feel it at the pump within a week. The Iranian coast on the northern side of the strait is studded with potential launch positions. Rocky promontories, concealed wadis, caves cut into hillsides. The Urgesi has spent 3 decades hardening those positions precisely because the strait is leverage. The threat of closure is more valuable than actual closure, most of the time. Coastal defense batteries, fast boat pens, shore-based radar, anti-ship cruise missile sites. A layered architecture designed to make any naval force think twice before pressing too close. On this morning, one of those batteries, a mobile unit equipped with Fateh-110 ballistic missiles mounted on transporter erector launchers, 4 vehicles in the revetment has been tasked with sending a message. Not a full war, not a closure, a message. Fire on the shipping column. Damage a hull or two. Demonstrate that the American buildup hasn't made the strait safe. Make the insurance markets react. Make the tanker captains radio their owners. Make Washington answer questions in front of cameras. The battery commander knows his unit is exposed the moment it fires. That's the calculation. Fire fast, scatter fast, disappear into the terrain before anyone can fix a coordinate and act on it. In the old calculus, before the surge, before the repositioning, he might have had 20 minutes, maybe 30, before American airpower could close the distance and find him. 20 minutes is enough time to drive his vehicles into the network of secondary roads and dispersal sites that the RGC has mapped across this coastline for exactly this scenario. He doesn't have 20 minutes, he has 9. Here's the detail that gets lost in all the noise about force levels and carrier groups. The surge didn't just add mass, it added persistent overhead. The MQ-9 Reaper orbiting at altitude above the eastern strait for the past 6 hours didn't arrive with the surge reinforcements. It was already there. What the surge changed was what happened to the targeting data it generated. Before the surge, that Reaper's feed went into a queue. Analysts reviewed it, flagged items of interest, passed reports up a chain that eventually reached someone with authority to act. That chain had friction, handoffs, people who needed to make calls on targeting packages, appropriate caution about authorizing kinetic responses to ambiguous ground movement on a foreign coastline. The friction was a feature, not a bug, most of the time. During the surge, that friction had been deliberately reduced for a specific category of threat. Coastal ballistic missile batteries that had fired on shipping were no longer an ambiguous target set requiring deliberation. They were a pre-approved response category. The Reaper's feed wasn't going into a queue. It was feeding directly into a Joint Task Force Common Operating Picture that had pre-tasked strike platforms and pre-authorized release criteria, waiting for exactly this type of event. The machine wasn't warming up. It had been idling at operating temperature for hours. The Fateh-110 is worth understanding, because what it is explains why the Urgesi chose it, and why that choice carried specific trackable signatures. It's Iran's most operationally proven indigenous ballistic missile, solid-fueled, which matters because liquid-fueled missiles require fueling time that creates a detection window. The Fateh-110 can be raised, aimed, and fired in minutes. Range is approximately 300 kilometers in its most capable variants, with circular error probable that's improved significantly across successive generations. Warhead mass runs around 450 to 650 kilograms depending on variant. Against an unarmored merchant hull, a tanker's steel plate, a bulk carrier's deck, a single hit is catastrophic. For coastal defense, the Fateh-110 is a serious threat to surface shipping. It's not a precision cruise missile threading through narrow corridors. It's a ballistic round, a plunging attack, difficult to intercept from shipboard systems not configured for the ballistic threat axis. The ERG knows this. The battery's opening salvo is designed to be effective. What the battery commander cannot fully account for is sensor fusion. The MQ-9 Reaper orbiting above the Strait, call sign Phantom 7 for this account, has been tracking the battery's ground movement since before dawn. The four tail vehicles arrived at the revetment under darkness, headlights off, moving along a coastal track the ERG had used before for exactly this kind of pre-positioned deployment. Reaper operators working in shifts, watching those four vehicles settle into their firing positions with the methodical patience of a crew that has rehearsed this sequence. The heat signatures were unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. The rectangular thermal profile of a tail bed, the faint glow of diesel engines at idle, the subtle shimmer off warm metal on a cool pre-dawn shore, the radar emitters doing their terrain survey, checking azimuth angles to the shipping lane, calculating firing solutions on a column of vessels that hadn't yet entered the kill box. The Reaper crew noted the activity, flagged it, started building a targeting package, vehicle count, position coordinates, orientation, terrain analysis of the surrounding road network for egress prediction. By the time the first Fateh-110 ignited its solid rocket motor, that package was approximately 80% complete. The launch event provided the final confirmation. When the first Fateh-110 ignites, the launch flash is visible to every overhead sensor in the theater simultaneously. The Reaper's targeting pod locks. The coordinate package is already partially built. It's been building for 6 hours. The launch event completes it. That data packet leaves the Reaper and reaches the relevant command nodes in under 30 seconds. Put yourself in the cockpit of a U.S. Navy A-10 Super Hornet flying combat air patrol, approximately 40 miles southwest of the Strait at this exact moment. Your threat display updates. Your radio crackles with a coordinate set and a tasking order. You are already supersonic before the Fateh-110 has finished its first minute of flight. And you are not alone. 2 U.S. Air Force A-10 Thunderbolt IIs, the aircraft that ERG planners genuinely do not want to see on their eastern horizon, are already feet dry, over the Iranian coastal shelf on a different tasking when the retargeting order comes through. The A-10 is not fast. It is not stealthy. It is not a long-range precision striker. What it is, in this context, is already positioned, already low, already inside the engagement radius, carrying the Gale 8 Avenger rotary cannon, a 30mm Gatling system that fires depleted uranium penetrator rounds at roughly 900 rounds per minute, and armed with AGM-65 Maverick air-to-ground missiles under each wing. The battery crew fires its third Fateh-110 at approximately T+90 seconds after the first launch. At T+4 minutes, the battery commander gives the scatter order. Correct doctrine. Exactly what he is supposed to do. The four tail vehicles begin moving, pulling out of the revetment, splitting onto separate routes. 2 vehicles east along the coastal road. 2 vehicles north into the broken terrain behind the ridge. The Reaper is watching all 4. What the battery commander cannot see is that the first A-10 is 60 seconds behind his lead vehicle and closing. The second A-10 is already over the ridgeline to the north. The FC-18 Super Hornet, arriving from the southwest at altitude, is computing a weapon solution on the road junction 3 kilometers east that his 2 eastern vehicles are about to reach, and from which there is no second exit. This is the part of the engagement the numbers don't fully capture. The mathematics of the surge are the 9-minute response window, but the geometry of the kill chain is what actually sealed the battery's fate. ERG dispersal doctrine assumes a reaction lag. It assumes the Americans need time to task, time to route aircraft, time to deconflict airspace, time to issue weapons-free authorization. Every one of those steps takes time in a peacetime posture, in a garrison posture, in a force that's still establishing its theater presence. A force in surge posture, with persistent overhead intelligence feeding a joint task force that has pre-delegated authorities for exactly this threat category, has already completed most of those steps before the first missile leaves the rail. Here's the take that will probably get us some pushback. The real mistake the ERG-C made wasn't tactical, it was institutional. Iranian military planners had studied American response timelines extensively, but the timelines they studied were from 2019, from 2021, from the cautious graduated response era. They hadn't updated their models for what a deliberate surge with pre-delegated strike authority actually looks like. The battery wasn't destroyed because Iranian soldiers fought badly. It was destroyed because Iranian planners planned against a version of American. Military power that no longer existed at that moment. That institutional lag is the real story here. Scene by scene. The first A-10, call it Hog 1, rolls in on the lead eastern vehicle at T+9 minutes, give or take seconds. The JAW-8 Avenger spins up. At 4,000 feet slant range, the burst goes out, a 2-second trigger pull, approximately 130 rounds. A sound that anyone who has heard it on the receiving end describes not as a gun firing, but as a physical event, a tearing of the air. The Fateh-110 Tel is a military truck with a launch rail on the back. It is not armored. The first burst walks up the vehicle's right rear quarter and through the cab. The vehicle doesn't explode immediately. It slides off the road and catches on the rocky verge, cab shredded, launch rail tilted at 30 degrees toward the ground. The second burst, 30 seconds later on the second pass, touches off the residual propellant in the rail assembly. Now it explodes. Simultaneously, and this simultaneity is the tactical signature of a networked fight, the second A-10, Hog 2, is rolling in on the northern vehicles. The terrain north of the ridge is rougher, the vehicle's slower. Hog 2 fires a Maverick first AGM-65G, imaging infrared, locked on the engine heat of the lead northern Tel, then follows with cannon as the Maverick guides to impact. The Maverick detonates under the vehicle's frame. The cannon burst takes the trailing vehicle attempting to reverse back down the ridge road. 4 minutes have elapsed since the first A-10 entered its attack run. The FCA-18 Super Hornet arrives over the road junction to the east. The two eastern vehicles were supposed to scatter through this junction onto diverging roads. One didn't make it past Hog 1's cannon. The second is attempting to turn at the junction when the Super Hornet's targeting pod confirms the visual. The pilot releases a GBU-12 Paveway-2, a 500-pound laser-guided bomb. The junction, the vehicle, and approximately 40 meters of road surface in both directions cease to be an escape route. The Reaper overhead logs the hits, confirms no vehicles moving, updates the battle damage assessment in real time. The battery that fired 3 Fateh-110 missiles at merchant shipping in the Strait of Hormuz is, as of T+13 minutes from first launch, 4 burning hulks on the Iranian coastal shelf. One complication deserves a moment. The Reaper's communications link dropped for approximately 90 seconds during the engagement, degraded data link, caused disputed and after-action analysis. For 90 seconds, Hog 2 was working from a last known coordinate, rather than a live track on the northern vehicles. The A-10 pilot made the call to press the attack on the last confirmed position rather than break off and wait for link. Restoration. Press or abort in 90 seconds of uncertainty. That's the kind of decision that lives in the gap between doctrine and execution. The pilot pressed. The track was accurate enough. The Maverick found its heat source. 90 seconds of data link outage that could have cost the mission. It didn't, but it was there. Now the cruise. The Fateh-110 battery required approximately 30 to 40 personnel to operate: drivers, launch technicians, radar operators, security detachment, command element. When the scatter order went out, those personnel were in and around the 4 vehicles. The attack unfolded over approximately 4 minutes. That is not enough time for personnel on foot in open rocky terrain to achieve meaningful distance from burning vehicles that American aircraft are actively servicing. What actually happens to battery crews in this scenario is a question military analysts handle carefully, because the honest answer is grim and the dramatic answer, they all escaped into the hills or nobody survived, is almost certainly wrong in both directions. Some personnel were almost certainly in the vehicles when the strikes hit. Some were outside the vehicles, on the road, in the terrain. The A-10's area of effect with the JAW-8 is significant, roughly a corridor along the vehicle track, but it's not omnidirectional. Personnel who had moved perpendicular to the road into the rocky breaks may well have survived the kinetic phase of the strike. Think about what those final minutes looked like from inside the battery. The scatter order comes through on the command net. Engines that have been idling for hours rev hard. Drivers who know exactly what the scatter order means, who have rehearsed the egress routes, who have family photographs tucked above the dashboard in some cases, who have spent months at this posting, watching the Strait and waiting for a mission that came this morning. Those drivers are trying to put distance between themselves and a position that is now a coordinate in an American targeting system. The launch technicians not in vehicles are moving on foot, away from the revetment, away from the road, trying to reach the rocky ground to the south where the terrain might offer cover. The radar operator is still at his console when the first distant sound of rotary cannon fire reaches the revetment from the east. He shuts down his equipment, standard emissions control procedure, and runs. Whether they escaped or were subsequently located is something this account can't answer with confidence. What Iranian state media reported, and what Iranian military statements implied, created a careful silence about specific losses at this location. That silence is its own data point. Here's what we'll say, and it gets uncomfortable quickly. The battery crew was executing lawful military orders under their chain of command. The Fateh-110 crews didn't design the strategy. They loaded the missiles, aimed at the coordinates they were given, fired on schedule, and tried to disperse as doctrine required. The violence of the American response fell on those men specifically and directly. That is the reality of the 9-minute window. It is also, from the American military's operational perspective, precisely the point. The speed and lethality of the response is not incidental, it is the message. One note on cost: this channel doesn't pretend the ledger only runs one way. The Fateh-110 missiles the battery fired cost Iran, in broad estimates, somewhere between $3 and $5 million per round. 3 rounds fired. The American response consumed Maverick missiles, a paveway bomb, cannon ammunition, and most significantly, flight hours and sortie costs on 3 aircraft plus a Reaper. The per-hour operating cost of an A-10 is relatively modest by military aviation standards. The FC-A-10 Super Hornet considerably more. The Reaper persistent surveillance, calculated across its mission time, adds more. The total American expenditure to destroy a battery worth perhaps $40 to $60 million, using munitions and flight operations worth perhaps $2 to $3 million, is a favorable exchange ratio. More to the point, it's a message delivered in a currency that cannot be misread. What does it mean? The surge posture the Irgi battery commander tried to exploit is, counterintuitively, the most dangerous moment for the side trying to use that window as a target. Here's why. A force in mid-surge is a force with elevated alert states, pre-positioned assets at forward locations, and pre-delegated authorities. The political decision to surge is also, implicitly, a decision to accept a higher likelihood of kinetic engagement. Strike authority doesn't get looser during a surge. It gets more specific. More pre-approved target sets, more defined response thresholds. Less requirement for each individual engagement to climb a chain of command before weapons free is issued. The Irgi battery commander was trying to catch the Americans between postures. What he actually caught was the Americans at the moment their institutional response machinery was running at its highest tempo. There's a doctrine term for this: cross-domain deterrence in an active surge environment. In plain language, it means every asset, air, sea, space, cyber, is feeding into a common operating picture being serviced by pre-tasked platforms with pre-approved response packages. The Reaper wasn't overhead by coincidence. The A-10s weren't in the neighborhood by accident. The FCA-A-10 Super Hornet wasn't on the right azimuth because of luck. These were pre-positioned pieces of a response architecture that had been designed, war-gamed, and rehearsed for exactly this threat category. The Fateh-110 coastal battery was, in the language of that architecture, a pre-identified target set. The moment it fired, it completed the authorization chain for its own destruction. What this tells us about American power projection in Hormuz is worth saying plainly. The era of the golden hour, the idea that an adversary can act against American interests and have a meaningful window before effective response, is over in this theater. That's not rhetoric. It's the operational reality that surge posture, combined with persistent ISR coverage and pre-delegated strike authority, has established. The 9-minute window is not an anomaly. It is a capability that has been deliberately built and deliberately demonstrated. That demonstration carries a cost. Sustained surge postures are expensive in money, in material wear, and personnel tempo. The A-10 airframes that rolled in on that coastal battery are old. The aircraft the U.S. Air Force has been trying to retire for a decade. The aircraft that keeps surviving budget battles because no replacement has matched its specific combination of persistence, payload, and lethality in the close air support role. The MQ-9 Reaper fleet is finite. The forward-deployed aviation assets cycling through the theater draw on a pool of trained aircrew with real limits. Maintaining a 9-minute response window is not free. So the question isn't just whether the response worked, it's whether the posture enabling that response can be sustained at the required tempo. We've spent a lot of time in the operational record here, and one detail kept coming back. The gap between what the Irgi's planning assumptions said about American response time and what the surge-postured force actually delivered isn't just a tactical surprise. It's a strategic intelligence failure. Iranian analysts tracking American military movements had the right data that could see the surge, count the aircraft, map the carrier positions. What they couldn't model was how the institutional machinery of the joint force had been reconfigured around that surge. The hardware was visible. The decision authority architecture wasn't. That's a harder problem to fix than buying better radar. It raises a question worth sitting with. If the IRG's intelligence apparatus failed to anticipate the 9-minute response, what does that failure mean for the next decision at the next battery on that coastline? The commanders who were not at this battery, who watched from headquarters as the after-action reports came in, who read the signals intelligence summaries, who briefed the Revolutionary Guard leadership on what happened and why, those commanders are now making new calculations. Some will conclude the lesson is to never again fire from a fixed coastal position to disperse further, to move faster. Some will conclude the lesson is to fire more simultaneously, to overwhelm the response architecture with volume rather than try to outrun it. And some, perhaps, will conclude that the American surge posture has changed the basic equation in ways requiring a strategic pause. Not surrender, but recognition that the arithmetic has shifted. Which of those lessons actually gets institutionalized inside the URG is, at this moment, genuinely unknown. It may be unknown to the URG itself. Back to the Strait of Hormuz, back to the merchant shipping column. 3 Fateh-110 missiles impacted near vessels in that column. Reporting on the specific damage varies. Hull strikes, near misses, one vessel with significant damage to its superstructure. The tankers continued their transit under emergency protocols, escorted by U.S. Navy vessels that had been moving to screen the column from the moment the first launch signature appeared on their radar. The cargo reached its destination, the oil moved. The coastal battery that fired those missiles is wreckage on the Iranian shore. There's a line in the post-engagement analysis that reads almost like the punchline of a very grim joke. The URG battery's mission was to demonstrate that the American surge hadn't made the Strait safe. The American response demonstrated, with 4 burning vehicles and a 9-minute clock, exactly the opposite. The question we keep coming back to is this. If you're the battery crew commander in those final minutes, scatter order issued, vehicles moving, the sound of something fast and low coming from the southwest, do you stay with your vehicle and try to drive faster, or do you abandon it and run for the terrain on foot? One choice keeps you with your unit but makes you part of a target the Reaper has already locked. The other might save your life but leaves you in open ground with no transport and no communications, on the wrong side of the Iranian coast with American aircraft overhead. Drop your answer in the comments. We genuinely want to know how you'd read that call. The Strait is still open, the shipping lanes are still moving, and the next battery commander looking at that coastline and doing his arithmetic is doing it with one very specific data point now embedded in his calculations, 9 minutes. If you want to see how this posture developed, how the U.S. went from a reactive force in Hormuz to a pre-postured kill, chain architecture that can service a target in under 10 minutes, that story starts with a different kind of engagement, a different kind of threat, and a weapon the URG thought was a trump card. We'll have it up shortly. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it.